Imagine waking up in ancient Rome, not in a villa with marble columns, but in a stinking, windowless room no bigger than a storage closet. The air is heavy with smoke from the neighbour's fire. Your straw mattress is crawling, and somewhere outside the street sellers are already shouting over the smell of sewage running past your door. You're a Roman woman, which means every choice you make, every word you say, is judged, controlled, and possibly punished. Your life is a balancing act between survival, duty, and the small scraps of freedom you can steal before someone notices. Before you get comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. I love seeing this little community stretch from Auckland to Austin. Now dim the lights, maybe switch on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's step through a very old doorway together. You open your eyes to footsteps overhead and a baby wailing somewhere down the corridor. Congratulations, you've woken up in a Roman insula, the ancient apartment block. Think multi-storey gamble, held together by plaster, prayer, and a landlord who pockets the rent faster than he fixes cracks. You live on the 4th floor? That's bad. The higher the floor, the poorer the tenant, and the more likely your ceiling gives way when someone drops an amphora upstairs. Your room is barely a cupboard, sweating walls in summer, a stone icebox in winter. A slit of a window admits light, smoke, and the occasional pigeon. The bed is a sack of straw, the blanket smells of damp wool and yesterday's weather. Furniture, a stool if you're lucky, a hook for your tunic, a clay cup with a chip shaped like Italy. That's the decor. There's no kitchen. Open flames indoors are banned. One stray spark and the whole block becomes a funeral pyre. Breakfast is pragmatic. A heel of bread dipped in watered wine. Maybe an olive if the market was kind. The good smells you imagine, fresh loaves, honey, rosemary, live mostly in rich houses and poets' lines. Your stairwell smells like feet, smoke, and the sharp sourness of the gutter. Toilets? Not here. Your chamber pot sits in the corner like an accusation. You brace your knees, lift it carefully, and start down 4 flights of narrow tilting stairs. On level 3, a neighbour mutters that you're late with the rent. On level 2, someone has spilled oil and spread sand over it, which helps until it doesn't. At the door, a feral cat slides past your ankles, triumphant with a stolen fish head. You angle the pot toward the street channel, dump, and pray the splash goes away from your sand. Outside, Rome is already awake. Criers shout prices, donkeys bray, and a fishmonger slaps a mullet on his counter hard enough to spray the bystanders. The air is a cocktail, baking bread from a bakery, acrid ammonia from the fuller's shop. They wash clothes in fermented urine, and the sea rot sweetness of garum wafting from a tavern. Water gurgles in lead pipes that tap the aqueduct, cleaner than the gutter, not as clean as you hope. You pull on a plain wool tunic, cinch it with a cord, and wrap your palla when you step into the street. A covered head reads as respectable. Your hair is coiled and pinned as neatly as a cracked mirror allows. Every gaze counts. Men judge, women judge harder. A wrong glance can turn into a rumour by noon. If you were here beside her, the woman you are now, you'd feel the paving stones bite through thin soles, hear iron-rimmed wheels shriek as a cart abuses the morning curfew, and watch ash drift from a brazier smith's forge like grey snow. You'd also learn the rhythm fast, hug the shade, keep one hand on your purse, never pause under a window when the chamber pots fly. Back upstairs, duty waits. If you're married, your husband is the legal sun your life orbits. If your father lives, his patria potestas still stretches like a long shadow over your choices: who you marry, what happens to your dowry, where your children live. You manage the household stores, the slaves if you have any, the laundry whether you do or not. You smooth quarrels, stretch grain, and keep the gods on your side with a pinch of incense at the lararium. You are essential and largely invisible. On market days, you know the shortcuts, the honest scales, the baker who won't water his dough. On bad days, you know the insults too. A shoulder bump becomes a slur becomes a hand, and you learn to move like water around stone. Respectability is armour you stitch every morning and unpick every night. Look up. Laundry stretches like flags between buildings. Graffiti debates politics, love, and bad poetry. A flute somewhere tries for a cheerful tune and almost makes it. Rome performs itself hour by hour. You adjust your palla, tuck a loose pin back into your hair, and step into the current. The city doesn't slow down for anyone, least of all for women, but you already knew that. You knew it the moment the ceiling dust fell in your eyes and you kept moving. Welcome to your ordinary morning. The marble myths will be back later. Right now, there are stairs to survive, water to carry, and a dozen unspoken rules to obey before the sun gets high enough to bake the rooftops white. Before you can navigate the streets of Rome, you have to understand the invisible leash that tugs at every decision you make. The patria potestas. It's Latin for power of the father, but don't let the word father fool you into picturing something warm. This isn't about bedtime stories and hugs. This is a legal authority that reaches into every corner of your life. If you are unmarried, your father is the law. If you're married, the law is your husband, or in some cases still your father, depending on the type of marriage contract. And this authority isn't metaphorical. Under Roman law, a paterfamilias can decide if you marry, divorce, keep your children, or even keep your life. In theory, he can execute a disobedient child. In practice, such extremes were rare, but the power itself was never in question. In wealthy houses, patria potestas could feel like living in a gilded cage. You might have fine clothing, servants to braid your hair, and a mosaic floor cool under your bare feet. But every coin, every piece of jewellery, every legal decision still belongs to the man at the head of the family. A father might use his daughter's hand in marriage as a tool for political alliances. Love is irrelevant. Your worth is in the value of your dowry and the influence your marriage brings. For poorer women, the same law applies without the marble trimmings. You might work a stall in the market, weave cloth for sale, or even rent out part of your insular room to travellers. But your father or husband decides if you can keep your earnings. If he gambles them away at the tavern, that's his right. If he wants to arrange your marriage to a man 20 years older because it means one less mouth to feed at home, the law is on his side. Imagine you've just turned 14, old enough in Roman eyes to marry. Your father informs you one evening over a dinner of lentils and bread that you're to wed the son of his business partner. You've met the man twice. He smells of goat and always talks about himself. Your opinion? Irrelevant. You nod because that's the safest thing to do. In a few weeks you'll stand before the household gods. Your hand in his, your life shifted from one authority to another. Divorce, though possible, is another man's game. A husband can send you away with little more than your personal clothing if the marriage is cum manu, meaning you legally pass into his family's control when you wed. If it's sin manu, you stay under your father's authority even while married, which can sometimes be an advantage, especially if your father is wealthier or more protective than your husband. But in both cases, you don't get to dictate the terms. Children too fall under the same chain of command. You might carry them for 9 months, birth them in agony, and raise them through fevers and teething. But the law says they belong to the paterfamilias. If he wants to expose a newborn, leave it to die because it's sickly, female, or simply unwanted, he can. Some fathers refuse, others don't hesitate. This power structure shapes how women speak, act, and even think. You learn early that the safest course is to present your ideas as suggestions, never demands. In public, your loyalty is to your household's reputation. In private, survival depends on reading the moods of the man in charge, knowing when to speak and when to stay silent. You might think rebellion would be common, but open defiance could ruin you. Instead, women learned subtler ways to influence decisions, careful flattery, indirect arguments, managing household finances so quietly that a man believes the savings were his idea all along. It's not freedom, but it's the art of making room to breathe inside the cage. If you were here, you'd see it in every home. A young wife, pouring wine for her husband's guests, laughs at the right moments, but never interrupts. A widow, still technically under her adult son's authority, offers him advice that somehow becomes the household policy. A daughter, stitching her dowry linens, hums to herself and listens, always listens, to the talk around her. Because information is the one currency a woman can trade without permission. And that's the paradox of patria potestas. It's absolute in theory, negotiable in practice, and always a shadow over your shoulder. You live with it, work around it, and sometimes, if you're clever enough, turn it into an advantage. But you never escape it. Not until the man who holds it over you dies. And even then, there's usually another waiting to take his place. In Rome, clothing isn't just something you wear. It's your resume, your passport, and your social contract stitched into wool and linen. Every colour, every fold, every accessory announces who you are, where you stand, and exactly how much respect or trouble you can expect in the street. And if you're a woman, your clothes are also a constant public statement about your chastity, your wealth, and your obedience to the unspoken rules. For most women, the day starts with a tunica, a basic undergarment of linen, or, for the poorer, coarse wool. It's simple, sleeveless or short-sleeved, tied at the waist with a cord. Over it comes the stola, the defining garment of a respectable Roman matron. Long, often floor-length, sleeveless but with wide straps, it's meant to drape modestly over your body, hiding rather than flaunting curves. Wearing a stola in public says you are married, respectable, and under the protection and control of your husband. If you are unmarried, your wardrobe is simpler. Just the tunic, perhaps belted higher for ease of movement. Widows, depending on wealth and mood, might keep the stola or abandon it for darker, plainer garments. Prostitutes, by law, are forbidden to wear the stola entirely. They often wear brighter colours, deliberately short tunics, or even the toga muliebris, a garment meant to mark their profession, as clearly as a shop sign. And then there's the palla. This is your outer wrap, a large rectangular cloak of wool, draped over your shoulders, and often drawn up to cover your head. The palla is more than warmth, it's armour. In a city where every glance can carry meaning, pulling the palla over your head says, "I am not here to be approached. Let it fall back," and the signal changes. Rome's streets are a conversation of fabric and posture, long before words are exchanged. For the wealthy, clothing is a palette for showing status without breaking the modesty code. A matron stola might be dyed soft saffron or pale green, colours that cost money but avoid the scandal of Tyrian purple, reserved for the richest of the elite. Embroidery at the hem or delicate weaving patterns might be subtle to an untrained eye, but will speak volumes to anyone who knows the craft. Shoes, often simple leather sandals, could be lined with felt in winter, studded with bronze clasps, or scented with imported oils for the wealthy. Poorer women's wardrobes are limited to a couple of tunics and perhaps a single pala for colder days. The wool is coarser, the colours duller, undyed brown, grey, or faded reds from cheap madder root. Repairs are frequent, visible, and practical. A rip is stitched with whatever thread is at hand. You carry your class on your back, and there's no hiding it. Jewellery, too, is a silent broadcast. A gold hairpin might be a gift from a husband, a token of wealth displayed in the open. Glass beads, common and affordable, are worn by the working class, though their bright colours mimic the gemstones worn by the elite. Bracelets and rings, often engraved, carry protective symbols or family emblems. Some women wear amulets against the evil eye, tucked discreetly under their clothes, a secret layer of meaning hidden from casual onlookers. Hair is its own battlefield. For a wealthy woman, elaborate styles, braids, rolls, waves, announce that you can afford the time and the servants to maintain them. Curling irons, heated over coals, shape locks into intricate patterns inspired by empresses. The poor manage with simple braids, pinned up to keep them out of the way while working. Hair dyes, often made from herbs or dangerous chemicals, allow brunettes to chase the fashionable golden shades at the risk of burns or breakage. Imagine stepping into the forum on a busy day. The sun glances off polished bronze pins in a senator's wife's hair as she sweeps past in a soft saffron stola. A fish seller's daughter hurries by in a plain grey tunic, a patched palla clutched around her shoulders. Two young women stand gossiping at a fountain, one with a crimson-dyed wrap that hints at her lover's wealth, the other with bare arms and short sleeves, her bracelets rattling as she gestures. Without a single word, you can place them on Rome's social ladder. But clothing is more than social display. It's also a leash. Step outside without the right garments, and you invite whispers. Or worse, wear something above your station, and you risk public shaming or legal trouble. Every morning, as you knot your belt or pull your pala across your head, you're making decisions about safety, reputation, and the unspoken codes of the city. And in Rome, those decisions can change the course of your day or your life. Beauty in ancient Rome was not an indulgence, it was a duty. For a woman, your face, hair, and skin were part of the currency you traded in social interactions. Appear flawless, and you might gain favour, influence, or simply avoid ridicule. Neglect yourself, and whispers would follow you from the forum to the bathhouses. But the tools Roman women used to maintain that perfect look, many of them were as dangerous as they were glamorous. Let's start with the skin. Pale, smooth skin wasn't just fashionable, it was a marker of class. It told the world you didn't labour outdoors under the Mediterranean sun. But without sunscreen or modern skincare, Roman women had to cheat. They turned to powders made from white lead or cerusin, substances that created an even, ghost-pale complexion. The problem? Lead absorbs through the skin. Slowly, silently, it poisons you, causing headaches, hair loss, even organ failure. The wealthier you were, the more you could afford such cosmetics, and the faster they could destroy your health. To achieve the look, a woman might sit before a polished bronze mirror while a servant dusted her face with the fine white powder. If her skin was dry, she'd mix it with oil to create a paste, smoothing it over imperfections. For blush, she might use crushed red ochre or cinnabar, mercury sulfide. Yes, mercury. A touch on the cheeks brought a fashionable flush, but over time, it could also bring tremors, memory loss, and madness. Eyes were framed with kohl made from soot or powdered antimony, applied with a small stick to darken the lids and lashes. It was a style borrowed from the East, seen as exotic and alluring. To make the whites of the eyes appear brighter, some women applied drops made from belladonna, literally beautiful woman in Italian centuries later. The extract dilated the pupils and gave a glassy, romantic gaze. It also happened to be toxic, with prolonged use risking blindness. Lip colour was another story. Some used crushed red iron oxide or plant dyes, others relied on mixtures of beeswax and vermilion pigment. The wax gave shine, but the pigment, again, was mercury-based. Perfumed oils might be added, both to mask any unpleasant chemical smell and to project wealth. Imported scents from Arabia or India could cost a small fortune, their exotic notes lingering as a subtle reminder of your husband's or lover's resources. Hair was equally high maintenance. The ideal was soft, wavy, and often lightened to a reddish gold, a shade the Romans associated with Germanic or Gaulish captives. Achieving this colour meant bleaching with a mixture of vinegar, ash, and sometimes goat urine, then spending hours in the sun with hair spread over a special frame. The sunbathing was meant to set the colour, but it often left hair brittle and prone to breaking. Wigs made from real human hair, often sourced from enslaved women in conquered lands, offered another solution. Blonde wigs from Gaul, black hair from India, all sewn into elaborate structures for feasts or public appearances. Eyebrows were shaped with tweezers made of bronze or iron. Thin arched brows were fashionable in some periods, while in others, a fuller, darker brow was in style. To fill in sparse brows, women used powdered charred rose petals, or even powdered mouse fur. Yes, mouse fur, mixed with resin. The effect was subtle, but the process, less than glamorous. Perfume was a final essential layer. Scent clung to hair, skin, and clothing, creating an aura of luxury. Roman perfumers used everything from myrrh to cinnamon, saffron to marjoram, blending oils in small alabaster jars. But perfumes were also used to disguise less pleasant odours, because Rome, with its crowded streets and poor sanitation, was not a city of fresh air. Imagine sitting at your dressing table in a cramped insular room or a lavish villa chamber. You lean toward a bronze mirror, coal stick in hand, as the morning light filters through the shutters. Your servant dabs lead paste onto your cheeks, careful to avoid smudging the cinnabar blush. You inhale the sharp scent of vinegar as she adjusts your hair, pulling the bleached strands into tight coils, fixing them with pins that will leave your scalp aching by nightfall. You spritz on perfume, the heavy sweetness of myrrh mixing with the faint metallic tang of your makeup. You look radiant, you feel powerful, and in some small way you're poisoning yourself. These rituals weren't optional. A wealthy woman who appeared in public without them risked being called lazy, sickly, or worse, unfeminine. A working-class woman might copy them with cheaper, even more dangerous substitutes. Chalk instead of lead, coal soot instead of antimony, knowing the results would never match the polish of the elite. Beauty was a game with high stakes, and the cost wasn't just in coins. In the end, looking the part in ancient Rome was both a mask and a weapon. It could elevate you, charm others, and cement your place in society, but it could also shorten your life, quietly, invisibly, one elegant morning at a time. In ancient Rome, the way a woman prepared herself in the morning wasn't just about looking presentable. It was a ritual that blended practicality, superstition, and the constant performance of respectability. The modern idea of personal hygiene simply didn't exist in the same way. Cleanliness was relative, and what counted as fresh would probably make you step back today. But within the limits of the era, Roman women developed their own routines to start the day. The first challenge was water. In a wealthy household, fresh water might be drawn from a private cistern, or even piped in from the aqueduct, flowing through lead pipes that gave it a faint metallic tang. In an insula, you fetched it from a public fountain, jostling for space with other residents, and hoping the supply wasn't cut off for repairs. The water could be clear or slightly cloudy, carrying bits of grit, and was never truly safe by modern standards. Face washing was simple, sometimes just a splash of cold water to wake up, sometimes a rinse with scented concoctions. Wealthier women might use rose water, steeped overnight in bronze basins to soften the skin. Others used vinegar diluted with water as a cleanser, believing it tightened the skin and kept it youthful. For the working poor, it was just cold water, maybe with a scrap of linen to scrub away the worst of the dirt. Teeth cleaning was more complicated. Romans didn't have toothbrushes as we know them. Instead, they used small sticks chewed at one end to fray the fibres, or toothpicks made from bronze, silver or bone. For paste, the recipes varied. Crushed charcoal, powdered pumice stone, sometimes mixed with salt, or even ground oyster shells. Some more dubious mixtures included ashes and herbs steeped in urine, which was thought to whiten teeth. The ammonia worked, but the smell lingered. Hair care came next. In wealthier homes, a servant, often an ornatrix, a specialist in hairdressing, would detangle and style the hair using bone or ivory combs. These combs often doubled as lice removal tools. And yes, lice were common, even among the rich. To scent the hair, women might rub in olive oil, infused with herbs like rosemary or bay leaves. Poorer women used wooden combs and simple braids, tying the ends with scraps of cloth or leather. Washing hair fully was not a daily event. It was more common to oil and scrape it clean, or to dust it with fine powders to absorb grease. Body cleaning depended heavily on access to baths. The public baths, thermae, were a cornerstone of Roman life, but they weren't always convenient or affordable for daily use, especially for women. Many preferred to bathe at home in small basins, pouring water over themselves from a jug. Soap, as we think of it, wasn't common. Instead, women used strigils, curved metal scrapers, to remove oil, sweat and dirt from the skin after rubbing themselves with olive oil. It left the skin soft, but the process could be messy, and the smell of rancid oil was a hazard if you couldn't afford fresh supplies. Clothing preparation was part of the morning too. In poorer households, you might have only one or two tunics, which needed regular rinsing and beating to keep them wearable. Laundry was often sent to the fulanuca, where garments were cleaned in vats of water mixed with clay, lye, and, most notoriously, fermented urine. The ammonia acted as a cleaning agent, but the scent was unmistakable, and many garments retained a faint trace of it, even after drying in the sun. Wealthy women had their laundry handled entirely by slaves and might wear freshly cleaned garments daily. Then there were the protective rituals. Some women carried small amulets against the evil eye, a polished stone, a phallic charm, or a tiny figurine tucked discreetly under the stola. A few sprinkled their faces with powders, blessed at a temple, or tied ribbons around their wrists to ward off illness. The morning toilette wasn't just about hygiene, it was about fortifying yourself for the day in a city where disease, gossip, and misfortune were constant threats. If you were here, you'd see the contrast clearly. In one domus, a young matron sits on a cushioned stool as her ornatrix oils her hair, pins it into an elaborate twist, and dabs her wrists with imported myrrh. In a cramped insular room, a working woman crouches over a basin, splashing her face with cold water before braiding her hair tightly so it won't catch on the loom. Both are following the same principle. Prepare yourself to be seen, because in Rome, eyes are always on you. And so, the morning ends with a final check in the mirror. Bronze or silver for the wealthy, polished tin for the poor. You smooth your tunic, adjust your parlour, and step out the door, ready to play your part in the endless performance of Roman life. In ancient Rome, the line between freedom and servitude was as visible as the clothes on your back. But for women, that line was often blurred by the roles they played inside the household. Even if you were a free-born Roman matron, your life was woven into the labour of enslaved women and servants who kept the domus or insula running. And if you happened to be one of those servants yourself, your world was a constant mix of grueling work, vulnerability, and the knowledge that your body, your time, and your future were not your own. For wealthy Roman women, the presence of slaves was a mark of status. A respectable household might have several: cooks, cleaners, wet nurses, ornatrices, personal hairdressers, seamstresses, and even female scribes. The ornatrix was especially important, as hair and presentation were social armour. She knew her mistress's beauty routines intimately, the hairpins that didn't pinch, the exact shade of rouge that complemented her skin tone, the little mole above her collarbone that needed to be covered before a public outing. This knowledge gave her a kind of informal power, enough that some wealthy women granted their ornatrices better clothing or lighter duties to keep them loyal. But make no mistake, even in these favoured roles, enslaved women had no legal personhood. They could be sold, punished, or abused at their owner's whim. A single mistake, a dropped comb, a burned garment, could mean a beating or demotion to heavier, dirtier labour. Enslaved women worked from before sunrise to after dark, often sleeping in cramped quarters near the kitchen or storerooms. In poorer households, the line between mistress and servant blurred. Some women owned a single, enslaved girl who worked alongside her, fetching water, helping with children, mending clothes. In such cases, both might rise before dawn. Both might climb the same steep stairs to the fountain. But one carried the weight of chains that weren't always visible. Outside the home, many enslaved women worked in trades or businesses that their owners profited from. Some ran stalls in the market, selling bread, cloth, or cosmetics. Others were rented out by the day for laundry work, weaving, or even as bath attendants in the thermae. And then there were the less respectable roles: prostitution, dancing, or entertainment at feasts, which could be forced upon them regardless of their wishes. For free women, especially those of the lower classes, working alongside slaves was common. A laundress in a Thessalonica might be free, might be enslaved, or might be a freed woman, someone manumitted by her master, but still tied to him legally and socially. Freed women often continue to work in the same household, their freedom more symbolic than practical. Life as a servant, whether free or enslaved, meant constant physical labour, carrying amphorae of water from the public fountains, grinding grain into flour with heavy stone querns, washing and beating clothes in vats of ammonia-rich water, cleaning floors with brooms of bundled twigs, scrubbing soot from lamps, and tending small cooking fires in smoky kitchens. The work never ended because the Roman household was always in motion. Meals to prepare, guests to serve, garments to mend. And yet, these women were the hidden engines of Roman society. Without their labour, the elegance of the wealthy would crumble overnight. The grand feasts, the immaculate stolas, the perfumed hair, none of it was possible without hours of invisible work. Some mistresses acknowledged this, many didn't. The labour was expected, the women themselves interchangeable. If you were here in a wealthy domus, you'd hear the shuffle of bare feet on mosaic floors before dawn, the soft clink of bronze pins in the ornatrix's hand, the hiss of a brazier being coaxed to life. In a poorer home, you'd hear the splash of water in a clay basin, the creak of stairs under a servant's weight, the muffled cough of someone who slept too close to the kitchen smoke. For the enslaved, there was no end to the workday, only a point at which the master or mistress decided it was done. For the free but poor, the end came when there was nothing more to sell, clean, or carry. Either way, the morning would come again, and with it, the cycle of service and survival. In Rome, power flowed from the top down, and women, whether mistresses or maids, were always somewhere in its shadow. In ancient Rome, what you ate, and how you ate it, was as much a reflection of your status as the clothes you wore. For women, food was both a daily necessity and a social marker, with the quality, variety, and even the timing of meals revealing exactly where you stood on Rome's social ladder. Let's start with breakfast, the ientaculum. For most women, especially the working poor, this was a quick, functional affair. A chunk of coarse bread, maybe dipped in watered wine, with a handful of olives or dried figs if the household was lucky. Wealthier women might add soft cheese, honey, or nuts, and they could afford fresh fruit brought in from the countryside, grapes in autumn, apples in winter, cherries in summer. The elite might even have pastries scented with sesame or anise, served still warm by a kitchen slave. But for the majority, breakfast was more about fuel than pleasure. The midday meal, prandium, varied depending on work and resources. For poorer women, it might be cold leftovers from the previous night's dinner, bread with garum, the infamous fermented fish sauce, a boiled egg, or a small portion of salted fish. Street vendors sold hot food in the thermopolia, tiny shop fronts with stone counters, inset with clay pots of stew, lentils, or spiced chickpeas. A woman on her own might grab a cup of barley porridge flavoured with leeks and pepper, eaten standing up before returning to work. For the wealthy, prandium could be a more leisurely event, served in a shaded courtyard. Cold meats, pickled vegetables, and exotic fruits imported from distant provinces might appear. A platter of oysters from Baiae, figs from Carthage, dates from Judea, each bite a reminder of Rome's vast reach. But even in these houses, the midday meal was smaller than the main event of the day. Cena, the evening meal, was where the real social theatre unfolded. For poorer families, it was the heartiest meal they'd see all day. A thick porridge of wheat or barley, maybe enriched with bits of pork fat or vegetables from the market. If they were lucky, there might be a small portion of fresh fish or meat, luxuries for those without steady income. Beans, lentils, cabbage and onions were staples, cheap and filling. Garum was everywhere, drizzled over almost everything, its salty, pungent flavour masking the taste of less than fresh ingredients. In wealthy homes, cena could be an elaborate, multi-course affair lasting hours. The gustatio, starter, might include eggs, lettuce or oysters, accompanied by mulsum, wine sweetened with honey. The main courses could be anything from roasted dormice, stuffed with pork and herbs, to whole peacocks served with their feathers reattached for dramatic presentation. Spices from India, pepper from the East, cinnamon and saffron, all outrageously expensive, were used liberally to show wealth. Sweet courses of nuts, honey cakes and fruit closed the meal, followed by wine mixed with water and flavoured with herbs. For women, dining customs carried their own set of rules. In elite households, a respectable matron might recline on a couch beside her husband during cena, though sometimes she would sit upright to maintain modesty. In poorer homes, everyone sat on stools or benches around a low table. The idea of eating alone was rare. Meals were communal, even in cramped insular rooms. Hygiene at the table was rudimentary. There were no forks. Food was eaten with the fingers, aided by spoons for soups and sauces. Diners wiped their hands on cloths or sometimes on bread, which was then thrown to the dogs. Water for rinsing was brought in basins, but in crowded homes this step was often skipped entirely. Seasonal scarcity also shaped meals. In summer, the heat spoiled fresh meat quickly, so salting, smoking or pickling were essential. In winter, fresh produce dwindled, and diets leaned heavily on stored grains and legumes. The poor suffered most during these times, relying on the state's grain dole, the annona, if they were eligible. For women managing households, stretching these rations into something edible was a daily test of ingenuity. There were also taboos and superstitions around food. Certain herbs were thought to promote fertility, others to prevent it. Some women avoided eating hare because it was believed to cause infertility. Others ate it for exactly the opposite reason, depending on local tradition. Garlic was valued for strength, but considered inappropriate for women of high status. It was too vulgar, too strongly scented. If you were here in a wealthy villa during cena, you'd see slaves circulating with silver platters, refilling cups, and sweeping away crumbs between courses. In a poor insula, you'd crouch over a clay bowl of steaming lentils, the air thick with the smell of garum and smoke, neighbours arguing through thin walls. In both places, food was more than sustenance, it was identity, ritual, and the measure of your place in the Roman world. And when the day ended, every belly, full or empty, told the same truth. In Rome, what you ate was never just about hunger. It was about power, privilege, and survival. If you wanted to understand the heartbeat of ancient Rome, you wouldn't go to the Senate or the Colosseum. You'd go to the markets. For women, especially those running a household, the Forum and its surrounding stalls weren't just a place to shop. They were the nerve centre of the city, where goods, gossip, and the occasional petty theft traded hands with equal speed. The most famous was the Forum Romanum, but unless you were wealthy or looking for luxury imports, you'd more likely head to one of the smaller specialised markets. The Forum Boreum sold cattle and meat, the Forum Holatorium was for vegetables, and the Forum Piscarium for fish. These places were noisy, crowded, and alive with smells both tempting and revolting. Imagine the sharp tang of garum mixing with the sweetness of ripe figs overlaid with the iron scent of fresh slaughtered meat, and the unmistakable reek of the tanner's stalls. Wealthy women rarely did their own shopping. Instead, they sent trusted slaves or freed women with lists and strict instructions not to be cheated. Still, some matrons enjoyed making appearances at the market, both to be seen in the right social circles and to have first pick of expensive imports. Silks from China, pepper from India, amber from the Baltic. These visits were as much about networking as they were about purchasing. A chance encounter at a spice stall could spark an alliance or a rumour. For poorer women, the market was a daily necessity, Without storage space or refrigeration, food had to be bought fresh, often just enough for that day's meals. The challenge was stretching a handful of coins into something filling. A cabbage, a few onions, a scoop of lentils, perhaps a small scrap of salted fish if there was money to spare. Prices fluctuated with the seasons, and shortages could double or triple the cost of staples. Bargaining was expected, but it was also an art. Vendors were known to raise prices at the sight of a wealthy-looking customer, and women developed reputations as hard bargainers. Some haggled fiercely over every coin. Others relied on building relationships with sellers, exchanging small favours or bits of gossip for better deals. The ability to get good prices wasn't just thrift. It was a point of pride, proof of one's skill as a housekeeper. Not all transactions were honest. Markets were hotbeds of pickpockets, cut purses, and quick change scams. A distracted buyer might find her coin purse lighter after a helpful stranger pointed out the ripeness of a melon. Children darted through the crowds, sometimes stealing for themselves, sometimes as part of organised gangs. Wealthy women sent guards or went in groups to deter trouble. Poorer women simply kept one hand on their purse and the other on their shopping basket. Beyond food, markets sold an astonishing variety of goods. Potters offered stacks of plates, bowls, and storage jars, some plain, others painted with mythological scenes. Cloth merchants displayed bolts of wool and linen in every shade the dye vats could produce. There were cosmetics, rouge, kohl, hairpins of bone and bronze, and small household tools, from knives to weaving combs. For those with money, jewellers offered gold rings and carved gemstones. For the rest, there were beads and copper trinkets. Street food was everywhere. Vendors sold honey cakes, roasted chestnuts, sausages sizzling on portable braziers. For a few coins you could eat as you shopped, savouring hot bread or a skewer of grilled meat. It was also a chance to taste foods you might not cook at home, dishes from distant provinces brought by merchants or immigrants. The market was also where news spread fastest. Announcements from magistrates might be read aloud, but rumours moved faster. Whispers about political unrest, the outcome of a gladiator match, or the scandalous behaviour of someone's neighbour. Women listened, contributed, and carried these tidbits home, where they could be traded like currency. If you were here, you'd see the layers of the market at work. A wealthy matron, her pallor draped just so, examines a basket of figs while her ornatrix discreetly inspects the seller's scales. A fishmonger slaps a fresh catch onto the counter, splashing the tunic of a young maid, buying on her mistress's behalf. Nearby, a poor woman fingers a scrap of dyed cloth, calculating whether she can spare the coin after buying bread. The air hums with voices, shouts, and the occasional clatter of a dropped amphora. By the time you leave, your basket is heavier, your purse lighter, and your head filled with the day's gossip. You've navigated the noise, the smells, and the ever-present risk of being cheated, and tomorrow you'll do it all again. In Rome, the market isn't just where you buy your dinner. It's where you measure your skill, your resourcefulness, and your place in the city's endless, chaotic dance. In ancient Rome, the public baths, the thermae, were far more than just places to wash. They were social hubs, relaxation spots, and in many ways, the heart of urban life. For women, the baths offered both opportunities and challenges, a rare chance to step out of the home, mingle, and even conduct business, but also a place where gossip spread like steam and privacy was a luxury few could afford. Roman baths were vast complexes, often with towering walls, marble floors, and elaborate mosaics. The largest included libraries, gardens, and exercise areas, But whether grand or modest, most followed the same layout. The apoditerium, changing room, the tepidarium, warm room, the caldarium, hot room, and the frigidarium, cold plunge. Wealthy cities boasted separate facilities for men and women, or at least separate hours. Smaller towns sometimes had shared spaces, though moralists frowned on mixed bathing. For women of means, visiting the baths was part of the daily or weekly routine. You might arrive in the late morning, escorted by a slave carrying your bathing supplies, oil flasks, a strigil, metal scraper, clean linen, and perhaps cosmetics for afterward. The apoditerium was lined with niches for storing clothes, guarded by attendants, though theft was still a constant risk. Here women greeted friends, exchanged news, and began the subtle dance of social observation. Who had gained weight, whose jewellery was new, whose face looked just a bit too pale. Bathing itself didn't involve soap in the modern sense. Instead, women rubbed themselves with olive oil, sometimes scented with herbs or flowers. This oil was massaged into the skin, loosening dirt and sweat, before being scraped away with the curved strigil. The sensation was both cleansing and slightly abrasive, leaving the skin smooth but sometimes reddened. In wealthy baths, attendants performed this for you. In smaller, cheaper facilities, you did it yourself. The caldarium was the steamy centrepiece, heated by a hypocauste system, an underfloor furnace that sent hot air circulating beneath the marble tiles. The heat opened pores, relaxed muscles, and made conversation slow and languid. Here women sat on benches, fanning themselves with towels, gossiping in low voices. Topics ranged from the latest Senate scandals to more domestic concerns. Marriage prospects, childbirth rumours, and which merchant was cheating his customers. After the caldarium, some moved to the tepidarium, a warm, dry room that felt almost luxurious after the steam. This was where you lingered, sipping watered wine or nibbling small snacks brought in by attendants. In some baths, masseuses worked here, kneading oil into tired limbs. For poorer women, this was also a chance to rest aching muscles without paying extra for private services. Finally came the frigidarium, the cold plunge. The shock of icy water after the heat was said to close the pores and invigorate the body. For some it was a brief dip. For others, a playful splash with friends. Children often joined their mothers here, squealing at the chill. The baths weren't just about the body, they were about presentation. Many women treated them as a prelude to going out, applying fresh cosmetics afterward. Mirrors clinked on the benches as rouge was dabbed. Kohl smoothed along eyelids, and hairpins adjusted. The wealthy might reapply costly perfumes. The poor might rub their skin with rosemary or mint leaves for scent. But the baths also carried risks. Illness could spread quickly in shared spaces. Physicians warned against lingering too long in the caldarium for fear of fainting or weakening the womb. Gossip, too, could be dangerous. One overheard comment could travel from bathhouse to market to dinner party in hours, altering reputations. And for women of certain backgrounds, simply being seen at the baths without the right companions could invite suspicion about their morals. If you were here in the baths of Caracalla on a bustling afternoon, you'd hear the echoes of laughter and conversation bouncing off the marble walls. Steam would rise in thick clouds, blurring the jewelled hairpins of a senator's wife as she gestures dramatically, while nearby a laundress scrubs herself briskly before rushing back to work. In the cold plunge, two girls shriek as an older woman scolds them for splashing her. And all around, the mingling scents of oil, perfume, and warm stone would wrap the space in a uniquely Roman atmosphere. Leaving the baths meant stepping back into the chaos of the streets, refreshed, scented, and, if you played your cards right, a little better informed about the city's undercurrents. For Roman women, the baths were as much about staying socially connected as staying clean. And in a world where appearances could make or break you, that connection was worth every coin. Religion in ancient Rome wasn't a private matter. It was public, communal, and deeply woven into every aspect of daily life. For women, it shaped not only their spiritual world, but also their social status, duties, and even their reputations. The temples, shrines, and household altars were places where a woman could gain honour, display piety, and sometimes even hold real influence, though always within the boundaries set by Rome's patriarchal order. The Roman religious system was vast and complex, with countless gods, spirits, and rituals to appease them. Every event, birth, marriage, harvest, military campaign, required the proper offerings. For women, religion often began at home, at the lararium, the household shrine to the Lars and Penates, the guardian spirits of family and home. Each morning, the woman of the house, or a female slave if she was wealthy, might light incense, pour a small libation of wine, and offer bread or fruit to these spirits. Keeping the Lars happy meant protection for the household, and neglecting them was seen as inviting misfortune. Beyond the home, temples were at the heart of religious life. Women were generally excluded from becoming priests of the most prestigious cults, but there were notable exceptions. The most famous were the Vestal Virgins, a small group of priestesses dedicated to Vesta, goddess of the hearth. Chosen as young girls, they took vows of chastity and served for 30 years, tending the sacred fire in the temple of Vesta. Their status was extraordinary. They could own property, free prisoners, and were honoured guests at public games. But their position was also perilous. Breaking their vow meant being buried alive, a punishment both horrifying and public. Other cults gave women more active participation. The Bonadea festival, dedicated to a goddess of fertility and healing, was strictly women only, so much so that even male animals were banned from the space. It was hosted in the home of a high-ranking magistrate, with rituals involving music, offerings, and the mixing of wine, officially forbidden to women in some contexts, but overlooked here. The secrecy around the Bonadea rites made them a fertile ground for scandal. One infamous incident involved a man sneaking in disguised as a woman, leading to political uproar. Foreign cults, too, attracted women, offering roles and freedoms they might not find in traditional Roman religion. The Egyptian cult of Isis, for example, welcomed female devotees, and its rituals, rich with incense, music, and processions, were both mystical and highly theatrical. Participation in such cults could be controversial. Conservative Romans saw them as dangerously un-Roman, yet they flourished among women seeking a deeper spiritual connection or escape from rigid societal norms. Festivals were another arena where women's religious role shone. During the Matronalia, honouring Juno Lucina, goddess of childbirth, married women received gifts from their husbands and servants. In return, they prayed for the health of their families and offered sacrifices at the temple. On the Floralia, celebrating Flora, goddess of flowers, women joined in garland making, games, and sometimes risque performances. This festival in particular had a reputation for being more indulgent than solemn. Religious observance also extended to life milestones. A woman's wedding day was steeped in ritual. Her hair was parted with a spear, symbolising the warrior's protection, and she offered coins to the household gods of her new home. Childbirth involved offerings to deities like Juno and Diana, along with protective charms to ward off Lamii and other spirits thought to prey on mothers and infants. But religion wasn't always safe. Being too closely associated with a particular cult could attract suspicion, especially in times of political tension. The suppression of the Bacchic cult in 186 BCE is a prime example. Its secret rites, which allowed women significant participation, were accused of fostering conspiracy and moral corruption. Hundreds were arrested, and the scandal reinforced the idea that women's religious gatherings needed male oversight. If you were here in Rome during a temple festival, you'd see the blend of devotion and display. A patrician matron, in her finest stola, leads a small procession to a marble temple, carrying an offering bowl of grain and flowers. Beside her, a freedwoman sprinkles incense over a brazier, the smoke curling into the morning air. At the steps, vendors sell wreaths, honey cakes, and small clay figurines of the gods. In the crowd, women greet each other, exchange news and subtly compare jewellery. Religion in Rome was as much about showing your place in society as it was about pleasing the gods. For women, it offered moments of visibility, influence, and community, within boundaries they could not cross. But within those limits, clever women found ways to make piety work for them, turning devotion into a tool for survival in the ever-watchful city. In ancient Rome, marriage wasn't simply about love, if love factored in at all. For women, it was a legal arrangement, a transfer of authority, and a lifelong test of obedience within the framework of patria potestas, the absolute power of a male head of the household. Whether you were a patrician's daughter or the child of a poor shopkeeper, marriage defined your role, your rights, and your future. There were two main forms of marriage for Roman women: cum manu, with the hand, and sine manu, without the hand. In cum manu, a woman passed completely into the control of her husband. She left her father's legal authority and became almost like an adopted daughter to her husband's family, losing rights to inherit from her own. Her property became his, and she could not own or dispose of anything without his consent. Sine manu, which became more common in later centuries, allowed a woman to remain under her father's authority even after marriage. This gave her more independence in theory, especially if her father died and she became sui juris legally independent. But in practice, her life was still heavily managed by male relatives. Marriages were often arranged to strengthen political alliances or consolidate wealth. Love matches happened, but they were rare in the upper classes. Fathers negotiated dowries, which could include money, land, slaves, or even businesses. The size of the dowry often determined a woman's perceived value in the match. A wealthy dowry could ensure a more advantageous husband, but also made a woman a target for marriage purely as a financial transaction. Wedding ceremonies were full of symbolism. On the morning of the wedding, the bride's hair was parted into 6 sections with a spearhead, a gesture meant to invoke the protection of warriors and the strength of Rome itself. She wore a flame-coloured veil, flammeum, over her head, a long tunic tied with the knot of Hercules at the waist, a knot her husband would later untie. Friends and family escorted her to her husband's home, sometimes by torchlight, in a procession filled with music and teasing songs. Crossing the threshold, she smeared the doorposts with oil or fat for good luck, and was welcomed with the words, "Where you are, Gaius, I am Gaia," signalling her acceptance into his household. Once married, a woman's duties were clear. She managed the household, overseeing slaves or servants, directing food preparation, supervising weaving, and ensuring the home ran smoothly. She was expected to be modest, loyal, and obedient, and to bear legitimate children to continue the family line. A woman's worth was often measured by her fertility, and infertility was grounds for divorce, though only at the husband's initiative. Roman law allowed husbands broad control. In early periods, under Manos, a husband could punish his wife for perceived disobedience, mismanagement of the home, or even for drinking wine, once considered a moral failing for women. In extreme cases, he could kill her for adultery or other dishonourable acts without trial, though this power was curbed over time. Even in sine manu marriages, husbands often exerted control socially and financially, using family pressure or public shaming. Divorce in Rome was surprisingly easy compared to later eras. Either spouse could initiate it by simply declaring the marriage over. However, the social consequences fell far more heavily on women. A divorced woman risked losing her dowry if she was blamed for the breakup, and her reputation could be permanently damaged. Wealthy women might remarry quickly to preserve social standing. Poorer women often had fewer choices and might return to their father's household. For elite women, marriage could also mean becoming a silent partner in politics. While they couldn't hold office or vote, their influence was felt through the alliances they helped forge, the gatherings they hosted, and the sons they raised for public life. Letters from the period suggest some wives advised their husbands in political matters, though always discreetly. For lower-class women, marriage was more about economic survival, pooling resources and labour in a world where single women had limited means of support. If you were here, you might see two very different wedding days. In a patrician villa, a young bride sits stiffly as her hair is divided with a spear, the air heavy with incense and the murmur of guests discussing her dowry. In a cramped insular courtyard, a working-class bride smiles shyly as neighbours throw nuts for good luck, her new husband already talking about the bread stall they'll run together. In both cases, the vows mark a turning point, one that binds the woman's future to the rules and authority of a man. Marriage in Rome was less about personal happiness and more about duty, to family, to the state, and to tradition. And for women, it was a role that demanded constant negotiation between expectation and survival. In ancient Rome, pregnancy and childbirth were both celebrated and feared. For women, they were the central expectation of married life, yet they carried real risks that even the wealthiest could not fully avoid. A Roman woman's worth was often measured by her ability to produce healthy children, preferably sons, yet the process of bringing them into the world was surrounded by uncertainty, superstition, and danger. From the moment a woman suspected she was pregnant, her daily life shifted. There were no pregnancy tests, only signs, missed menstrual cycles, nausea, changes in appetite. Older women, midwives, and mothers-in-law claimed to know the sex of the baby by how the mother carried it, or what she craved. But these were guesses dressed as wisdom. In wealthier homes, women might reduce public appearances, not for modesty alone, but to protect themselves from illness, and to avoid gossip if the pregnancy failed. Pregnancy care was based on diet, rest, and ritual. Physicians like Soranus advised against heavy labour, tight clothing, or strong emotions. Certain foods, honey, eggs, figs, were believed to strengthen the baby, while others, like overly salty or bitter foods, were thought to be harmful. Amulets against the evil eye were worn around the neck, often carved with protective symbols or the image of Fortuna. Women prayed to Juno Lucina, goddess of childbirth, and made offerings of cakes or flowers at her temple, asking for an easy delivery. When the time came to give birth, the setting depended on status. In a wealthy domus, the birth might take place in a warm, clean room with multiple attendants, a medica, female doctor, though rare, one or more experienced midwives, obstetrices, and trusted female relatives. Poorer women often gave birth in their own cramped rooms or in the homes of relatives, with a single midwife or neighbour to assist. There was no concept of a hospital birth. The birthing position was usually seated on a special stool with a cutout in the middle, allowing gravity to assist. Midwives massaged the abdomen, applied oils, and offered herbal infusions to ease pain or stimulate contractions. Some herbs were genuinely helpful, others were more superstition than science. The screams of labour were considered natural. If anything, they were thought to show strength and determination. Complications were common. Without modern medicine, prolonged labour, breech births, and hemorrhaging could be fatal. Even successful deliveries carried the risk of postpartum infections. For every celebrated birth, there were quiet tragedies. Mothers or infants lost before the household could even rejoice. Wealth offered slightly better odds through access to skilled attendants, but even empresses were not immune to the dangers. If the child was born healthy, the first moments were ritualised. A midwife placed the baby on the ground. If the father lifted the child, it signalled acceptance into the family. If he refused, the infant could be exposed, left to die, or be taken in by others. This harsh practice, while not universal, was more common among the poor, or when the child was deformed, illegitimate, or simply unwanted. Naming took place on the 8th day for girls. Dies lustricus, with a small ceremony involving offerings and the placing of a protective amulet, bulla, around the baby's neck. Wealthy families hosted gatherings, poorer ones kept it simple, but the symbolism was the same. The child now belonged to the community. Motherhood didn't end with birth. It was a constant balancing act. Infant mortality was high. Some estimates suggest that only half of children lived past age 10. Feeding depended on resources and status. Wealthy women often employed wet nurses, freeing themselves from nursing duties and ensuring their milk supply wasn't interrupted by another pregnancy too soon. Poorer women nursed their own children, sometimes while working, and supplemented with porridge or bread, soaked in wine or water, as the child grew. Childhood itself was short. By age 7, girls might already help with household chores. Boys began basic education if the family could afford it. Girls of wealthy families learned weaving, music, and household management. Poorer girls learned whatever trade or labour their mothers practiced. Play existed. Dolls, hoops, knucklebones, but even games often carried lessons in the skills they'd need as adults. If you were here, you'd see a scene both intimate and public. In a wealthy home, a midwife swaddles a newborn in fine linen while the mother, pale but smiling, receives visitors bearing amulets for good fortune. In a cramped insular room, a young woman rocks her infant beside the glow of a clay lamp, already thinking about tomorrow's trip to the market. In both cases, the joy of new life is tempered by the knowledge that survival for mother and child remains uncertain. In Rome, pregnancy and childbirth were not just biological events. They were social, religious, and deeply political acts. Every new life carried the weight of family honour, economic survival, and the city's unending hunger for citizens. And for women, they were the most dangerous duty they were expected to perform. In ancient Rome, the upbringing of girls was shaped by a single, unshakable goal: preparing them to become respectable wives and capable managers of households. Education was not about personal ambition or career prospects. It was about moulding character, teaching obedience, and ensuring that a girl could fulfill the duties expected of her in adulthood. The path a girl followed depended heavily on her family's social class, but even in the wealthiest homes, the curriculum was as much moral as it was practical. From the moment a girl could walk, her life was under careful supervision. In the early years, her education took place entirely at home, under the guidance of her mother, female relatives, and household slaves. The nutrix, often a Greek or educated slave, played a central role, not only caring for the child's physical needs, but also shaping her manners and speech. Girls in wealthy households sometimes had better linguistic training than their brothers at this stage, especially if their nurse spoke refined Greek. Basic literacy was considered useful, though not essential for all women. In elite families, girls learned to read and write Latin and often Greek. They studied the basics of arithmetic, enough to manage household accounts, and memorized moral maxims. Greek poetry, myths, and moral stories were sometimes included, but the focus was always on shaping character, not on producing intellectuals. A well-read woman was admired, but a woman considered too clever risked being labelled immodest or unfeminine. Practical skills formed the core of a girl's education. Weaving and spinning were seen as the most virtuous and traditional tasks for Roman women, symbolising both domesticity and industry. Even the wives of senators might weave their family's clothing, at least ceremonially, to display their virtue. Girls learned to prepare food, manage servants, keep accounts, and make medicines from herbs. These skills weren't optional, they were survival tools, whether the household had 10 slaves or none. Moral instruction was relentless. Girls were taught to be modest in speech and dress, to avoid eye contact with strange men, and to move quietly in public. They were told stories of virtuous Roman matrons, like Lucretia, famed for her chastity, or Cornelia, mother of the Gracchi brothers, celebrated for her devotion to her children. These tales served as both inspiration and warning. Honour brought respect, dishonour brought ruin. Social training began early. Girls accompanied their mothers to religious festivals, weddings, and funerals, learning how to behave in different settings. They observed how their mothers spoke to clients, managed disputes among servants, and maintained the family's reputation. In elite circles, they might be taught music, dancing, and even a little philosophy, skills that could be displayed at dinner parties or in private gatherings. For poorer girls, education was far more limited. If they learned to read, it was often from an older sibling or a local school that charged modest fees. Their curriculum was the work their mothers did, selling goods at the market, preparing meals, mending clothes, or helping in the family's small shop. By adolescence, these girls were active contributors to the household economy, often with little time for formal study. By the age of 12 or 13, a girl's education began to merge with her preparation for marriage. In wealthier homes, this meant learning the intricacies of managing estates, handling correspondence, and entertaining guests. In poorer homes, it meant becoming competent in every domestic chore, from fetching water to budgeting the week's bread supply. The differences between boys' and girls' education were stark. Boys might study rhetoric, law, and military history. Girls were rarely taught subjects that could lead to public roles. Even when they shared a tutor with brothers, the emphasis for girls remained on refinement and virtue, not debate or leadership. If you were here in an elite Roman villa, you might see a young girl seated beside her mother, embroidering a tunic as a Greek slave reads aloud from Homer. Across the city, in a noisy insula, another girl kneels by the hearth, learning from her mother how to stretch a small pot of lentils to feed the family until market day. Both are receiving their education, shaped entirely by the life their birth has assigned them. In Rome, a girl's upbringing was an investment in the stability of the household, and by extension, the stability of the state. Her mind was shaped to serve family honour, her skills honed for domestic survival. Whether she lived in marble halls or a single smoky room, her education was never truly her own. It was a preparation for a role she did not choose, but was expected to perform flawlessly. In ancient Rome, the idea of a working woman carried very different meanings, depending on class, status, and legal freedom. For wealthy Roman matrons, earning money directly was rare and often seen as improper. Their labour was in managing estates, directing servants, and maintaining the family social standing. But for the majority of women, especially freed women, and those from poorer families, work was not a choice. It was a necessity for survival, and the range of occupations they took on was both broad and deeply revealing about Roman society. One of the most common and respected occupations for women was weaving and textile production. This was not simply a domestic skill, it was a commercial industry. Women spun wool, wove cloth, and sometimes embroidered fine garments for sale. In poorer households, the loom stood in the main room, and work continued between cooking, cleaning, and childcare. Wealthier women might run workshops, employing slaves or freed women to produce textiles on a larger scale. Inscriptions survive of women honoured for their skill as lanifiche, wool workers, indicating that textile work could be both a respected trade and a steady source of income. The food industry also offered opportunities. Women sold bread, fruit, vegetables, and cooked meals in markets and from street stalls. Some ran small taverns, popinae, or wine shops, although these could carry a questionable reputation. Tavern keepers, especially female ones, were often associated with gambling, prostitution, or shady dealings. Still, for widows or single women, running such a business could be one of the few paths to financial independence. Midwifery and medicine were other notable professions. Obstetrices, midwives, were vital in a world where childbirth was dangerous, and their skills could mean the difference between life and death. Some also acted as general healers, preparing herbal remedies, setting bones, and offering treatments for ailments. While male doctors dominated formal medicine, female healers were often more trusted for women's health issues. A few became wealthy and well-known, but most worked for modest fees, sometimes paid in goods rather than coin. The service sector employed countless women as hairdressers, ornatresses, bath attendants, wet nurses, and domestic servants. In elite households, an ornatrix could become a trusted confidant, styling hair and applying cosmetics for her mistress, while absorbing and sometimes influencing household politics. Bath attendants worked in the thermae, managing oil, towels and strigils, often while overhearing the latest gossip. Wet nurses cared for infants, not only feeding them but often shaping their early language and manners, a role that could form lifelong bonds. Entertainment offered both opportunity and risk. Female dancers, musicians and singers could perform at banquets, festivals or theatres. While some enjoyed patronage and fame, many were seen as little better than prostitutes. In fact, the line between performance and sex work was often thin, especially for enslaved women, whose owners profited from both. Sex work itself was legal in Rome, though heavily stigmatised. Prostitutes, whether street workers or high-class meretrices had to register with authorities and wore distinctive clothing. For some freed women, it was a path to wealth and even influence. For most, it was a dangerous and exploitative reality. Merchants and shopkeepers were not uncommon. Some women inherited businesses from husbands or fathers and continued to run them successfully. Inscriptions record women as sellers of perfumes, jewellers, and even importers of luxury goods. Legal restrictions sometimes required a male guardian to oversee contracts, but in practice many women managed their affairs independently, especially if widowed or freed from tutela, male guardianship. For the poorest, casual labour was the norm. Women carried water, cleaned streets, or hired themselves out for farm work during harvest seasons. Pay was low, conditions were harsh, and there was little job security. Slavery, of course, provided an endless supply of female labour for every conceivable task, from fieldwork to domestic service to skilled trades. For enslaved women, there was no wage at all, only the possibility of manumission if their owner saw fit. If you were here in Rome on a busy morning, you might see the full spectrum. A matron in a fine stola strolls through the market, inspecting bolts of imported silk sold by a freed woman who inherited her stool from her father. In the shadow of an archway, a young girl spins wool, while her mother bakes bread for sale. Near the baths, an ornatrix arranges a wealthy patron's hair into an elaborate tower of braids, while a midwife hurries past with a bundle of herbs tied at her waist. Down a side street, musicians tune their lyres, preparing to play for a dinner party, where guests will praise their skill, then look down on them for performing at all. Work for women in Rome was shaped by necessity, opportunity, and the boundaries of respectability. For some, it was a path to modest prosperity. For others, it was endless labour for survival. In every case, it revealed the constant negotiation Roman women faced between earning a living and preserving their place in a society that valued their labour, but rarely their independence. In ancient Rome, social life was as much a survival tool as it was a form of entertainment, especially for women. Friendships, alliances, and even rivalries could determine a woman's security, reputation, and influence. While men had the forum and political clubs, women's social networks operated in more subtle spaces: private homes, markets, temples, and the baths. Within these circles, loyalty could be powerful, but so could betrayal. For elite women, much of social life revolved around the domus, the private home. They hosted dinners, managed guest lists, and orchestrated the intricate dance of favours and obligations. A well-executed gathering wasn't just about good food. It was about demonstrating wealth, taste, and the ability to attract the right mix of people. These events were also where alliances were quietly forged. A matron might introduce her daughter to the wife of a powerful senator, hoping to plant the seeds for a marriage alliance. Another might discreetly pass along news that could be useful or damaging to her host's rivals. Temples and religious festivals provided another crucial venue for social interaction. A woman attending the Matronalia festival could greet dozens of acquaintances in a single morning, exchanging compliments, gifts, and rumours. These public gatherings were also carefully watched spaces. Who you greeted warmly, who you ignored, and who you were seen standing beside could all send messages to the community. For poorer women, market days served a similar function, a chance to check prices, but also to swap information, arrange trades, and keep up with neighbourhood politics. The Roman baths were especially fertile ground for networking. In the women's section, conversations flowed as freely as the steam. Here, gossip was currency, learning which merchant had cheated his customers, which husband was rumoured to have a mistress, or which family was secretly in debt could give a woman leverage in her own dealings. The danger was that gossip cut both ways. One careless remark could become the day's most damaging rumour. Friendship among women could be deeply loyal. Letters from antiquity speak of women comforting each other after losses, helping to raise each other's children, and even acting as guardians in times of trouble. However, the same environment that bred solidarity also encouraged rivalry. Competition for status was fierce. Who wore the finest stola, who hosted the most lavish banquet, whose son was praised by his tutor. In elite circles, an insult could be disguised as a compliment, and a seemingly small slight, like failing to invite someone to a dinner, could ignite years of cold hostility. Among working-class women, social life was often intertwined with labour. Market vendors formed tight-knit groups, watching each other's stalls, pooling money for festivals, and helping in emergencies. But disputes over territory, pricing, or customers could turn friends into bitter enemies. In cramped insula, quarrels between neighbours were common, sometimes spilling into public shouting matches that drew curious crowds. Marriage also shaped social networks. A woman's friends might shift after her wedding, as she joined her husband's household and its circle of allies. For some, this meant losing contact with childhood companions. For others, it meant gaining access to more influential circles. Divorce could scramble these alliances again, forcing a woman to navigate carefully between old loyalties and new realities. If you were here in Rome on a sunny afternoon, you might see a matron in the Forum Boreum, smiling warmly at a woman she will later undercut with a well-placed rumour. In the Subura district, two laundresses share bread and wine, laughing over a neighbour's misfortune, while silently calculating how to underbid her prices. In the baths, a group of women leans close, speaking in low voices about a scandal in the household of a magistrate, each filing away the information for future use. For Roman women, social life was never just idle chatter. It was a game played daily, with stakes that could affect marriages, business opportunities, and personal safety. Friendships could offer protection, support, and joy, but they could also turn into rivalries with the potential to destroy reputations. In a society where public image was everything, knowing whom to trust and when to betray was a skill as essential as weaving or cooking. In ancient Rome, clothing was never just about keeping warm or covering the body. It was a language of status, respectability, and identity. For women, every piece of fabric, every colour, and every ornament sent a message about who they were, what they could afford, and where they belonged in the social hierarchy. The rules of fashion were both strict and subtle, and breaking them, intentionally or not, could spark gossip, admiration, or scandal. The foundation of a respectable Roman woman's wardrobe was the stola. This long sleeveless garment, usually made of wool or linen, was worn over a basic tunic and fastened at the shoulders with clasps or brooches. For married women of citizen status, the stola was more than clothing. It was a badge of honour, signalling chastity and legal marriage. Women without the right to wear a stola, such as slaves, freed women without certain rights or prostitutes, were instantly identifiable, no matter how fine their other garments. The palla was the outer wrap, a large rectangular shawl draped over the shoulders and around the body, sometimes pulled up over the head for modesty or to shield from the sun. In public, how a woman arranged her palla could show whether she was conservative, fashionable, or perhaps too bold for her own good. The colours and fabrics varied by wealth: undyed wool for the poor, soft imported linen for the middle class, and shimmering silks for the elite, though silk was controversial, with moralists complaining that it was too revealing and dangerously luxurious. Colour itself carried meaning. White and natural tones suggested modesty and respectability. Bright reds, purples and yellows were associated with wealth, celebration, or sometimes immorality. Tyrian purple, the most expensive dye in the Roman world, was legally restricted to certain ranks. But wealthy women often found ways to incorporate a hint of it into borders or accessories. Black, meanwhile, was reserved for mourning. Wearing it at the wrong time could be seen as a deliberate insult. Jewellery was another powerful social signal. Gold, silver and bronze were common materials, with pearls and gemstones prized for their beauty and rarity. Earrings, necklaces, bracelets and finger rings could be stacked in lavish displays, especially at public gatherings. Wealthy women sometimes wore elaborate hairpins tipped with precious stones, not only decorative, but occasionally sharp enough to serve as a weapon. Poorer women wore simpler bronze or glass bead pieces, but even these were carefully chosen. Hair was perhaps the most visible expression of fashion. Elite women employed ornatresses, skilled hairdressers, who could spend hours arranging intricate styles. Curls, braids and waves were shaped with heated metal rods, and elaborate structures might include hairpieces or even wigs made from imported hair. Some styles were inspired by empresses, others copied from foreign cultures, sparking debates about whether such fashions were refined or decadent. For poorer women, hairstyles were simpler, braids pinned up, or hair tied with a strip of cloth. But even these could be neat and attractive with care. Cosmetics were widely used, though opinions about them were mixed. Face powders made from lead carbonate gave a pale complexion. Dangerous, but fashionable. Rouge from red ochre or wine dregs added colour to the cheeks, while kohl lined the eyes. Perfumes from rose, myrrh or imported spices completed the effect, though the most expensive scents could cost as much as a slave. Critics claimed that cosmetics were deceptive, trapping men with false beauty, but that did little to slow their popularity. Footwear ranged from simple leather sandals, solis, to more decorative shoes with dyed straps and metal fittings. Indoors, women might go barefoot, especially in private homes. On the streets, wealthier women favoured shoes that matched their outfits, while the poor wore sturdy, practical sandals meant to last through daily labour. If you were here in the Forum on a busy day, you'd see fashion as a silent conversation. A senator's wife passes in a pale stola with a purple-trimmed palla, her hair piled high in an intricate crown of braids. A freed woman selling perfumes wears a brightly dyed dress with bronze bracelets that catch the sunlight, announcing prosperity without challenging elite style. Nearby, a young slave in a plain tunic hurries past, balancing a basket of fabrics she will never wear herself. In Rome, clothing and adornment were more than personal choices. They were statements of status, morality and ambition. A well-dressed woman could command attention, win respect or stir envy, but she always walked the fine line between admiration and judgment. Fashion was both armour and advertisement, a way to navigate the city's ever-watchful gaze. In ancient Rome, a woman's health was a constant negotiation between what her body needed, what society allowed, and what medicine of the time could actually offer. Without modern understanding of disease, illness was explained through a mix of humoral theory, superstition, and folk remedies. And while some Roman medical practices were surprisingly advanced, others were ineffective or even harmful. For most Roman women, day-to-day health began with hygiene. Contrary to the stereotype of a dirty ancient world, Romans valued cleanliness highly, at least in theory. Wealthy women bathed regularly in the thermae, the public baths, which had separate sections or times for women. There they moved through heated rooms, soaked in warm pools, and finished with a cold plunge. Oils were rubbed into the skin, then scraped off with a curved metal strigil, taking dirt and sweat with them. Afterward, perfumes might be applied to mask the inevitable smells of crowded city life. Poorer women didn't always have the luxury of public baths. Entrance fees, though small, added up, but they washed at public fountains or in their own homes using basins of water. Soap was not widely used. Instead, they relied on oils, sand, or even urine for cleaning and bleaching fabric. Clothing was laundered in fullernica, public laundries, where ammonia from urine helped lift stains. Diet played a major role in health, though not always in beneficial ways. Wealthy women could afford a variety of foods: fresh fruits, vegetables, fish and meats, along with imports like pepper, cinnamon and dates. Poorer women lived mainly on bread, porridge, olives and seasonal produce, with meat as an occasional luxury. Malnutrition was common among the lower classes, especially for women who sacrificed their own portions to feed children. Medical care came from several sources. Professional doctors, medici, often Greek-trained men, treated wealthier patients. Women might also see female doctors, medicae, though they were less common and often specialised in gynecology and childbirth. For most women, however, the first line of care was the midwife or local healer, who relied on herbal remedies, poultices, and traditional knowledge. The humoral theory dominated medical thinking. Illness was believed to result from imbalances in the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Treatments aimed to restore balance, which could mean bloodletting, purging, or changes in diet. For women, many ailments were attributed to the womb. The concept of the wandering womb suggested that the uterus could move through the body, causing headaches, hysteria, or even suffocation. Treatments ranged from inhaling sweet-smelling herbs to lure it back into place, to more invasive and questionable methods. Superstition was inseparable from medicine. Amulets were worn to protect against illness, inscribed with charms or depictions of protective gods. Women prayed to deities like Salus Health, Bona Dea, and Juno Lutina for recovery from sickness. In some cases, magical remedies were prescribed, such as wearing a live spider in a walnut shell to cure fever. While these may seem absurd now, they were part of a broader belief system where the physical and spiritual were intertwined. Injuries and chronic conditions were treated with varying success. Broken bones could be set and splintered, wounds cleaned with wine or vinegar, and certain surgeries performed with bronze or iron tools. However, infection was a constant danger, and without antibiotics, even minor cuts could become fatal. Reproductive health was both crucial and risky. Herbal contraceptives existed, such as silphium, a now extinct plant prized for its supposed effectiveness, but their reliability was uncertain. Abortions were known and could be induced with strong herbs, but they carried high risks for the mother. Menstruation, pregnancy and childbirth were all treated with a mix of medical advice and superstition, often blurring the line between helpful care and harmful myth. If you were here, you might see a wealthy woman reclining in her villa, sipping a honey and herb infusion prescribed by her doctor, while her ornatrix applies perfumed oil to her skin. In a crowded insula, a mother grinds garlic and rue into a paste to treat her daughter's cough, muttering a protective charm under her breath. At the baths, women gossip about which healer is best for aching joints, or which amulet has kept their children free from fever this year. Health in Rome was fragile, and a woman's ability to protect it depended on her resources, connections, and a fair amount of luck. Between the genuine skill of some physicians and the deep roots of superstition, Roman women navigated a medical world where cures could heal or harm just as easily. In ancient Rome, religion was not just a matter of private belief, it was the heartbeat of daily life, woven into politics, family duties, and even the calendar itself. For women, it shaped their roles, their reputations, and their sense of security. Every stage of life, from birth to death, was accompanied by ritual, and ignoring those rituals was considered not only unlucky, but dangerous for the entire household. Roman religion was polytheistic, with a vast pantheon of gods, goddesses, and household spirits. Women interacted with them constantly, lighting lamps at small shrines, offering flowers or incense, and making vows in exchange for divine favour. The home was the centre of this worship. Every household had its lararium, a small shrine to the Lares and Penates, the protective spirits of the family and the pantry. Women tended these shrines daily, offering bits of food or wine to ensure the family's safety and prosperity. Public religion, however, offered women a chance to be visible in the community. Certain festivals were explicitly for them. The Matronalia in March celebrated marriage and motherhood. Wives received gifts from husbands, and women brought offerings to Juno Lutina, goddess of childbirth. The Bona Dea festival, held in December, was exclusively for women, with men strictly forbidden. Hosted in the home of a magistrate, it included rituals of fertility, health, and protection, though the exact details were kept secret from men. Women also served as priestesses, a position that could bring both honour and influence. The most famous were the Vestal Virgins, 6 priestesses dedicated to Vesta, goddess of the hearth. Chosen as children, they served for 30 years, keeping the sacred flame in the temple of Vesta burning at all times. Vestals enjoyed privileges rare for women, owning property, making wills, and being free from male guardianship. But they also faced severe punishments for breaking their vows of chastity. Outside formal religion, superstition shaped daily life. Omens were everywhere. A bird flying from left to right, a sneeze at the wrong moment, the sudden extinguishing of a lamp. Women often carried amulets, small carvings of phalluses for protection against the evil eye, beads of amber, or charms inscribed with magical formulas. Some wore small metal boxes, bulla or crepundia, containing herbs or pieces of bone, believed to repel illness or misfortune. Divination was common, especially in uncertain times. Women might consult a fortune teller in the market, a swords, lot drawing at a temple, or a dream interpreter. In wealthier circles, astrologers were fashionable, reading the stars to predict marriage prospects, childbirth, or political fortunes. This could be risky. Emperors like Tiberius and Domitian punished astrologers they believed were spreading dangerous prophecies, but it didn't stop people from seeking their advice. Ritual purity was another major concern. Certain life events, menstruation, childbirth, death, required purification rites before a woman could participate in religious ceremonies. Failure to perform these correctly was believed to offend the gods, potentially bringing misfortune on the entire household. For childbirth, women wore protective charms and made offerings beforehand. After, they might undergo a lustration ceremony to restore ritual purity. Festivals also offered a mix of devotion and social opportunity. During the Floralia, honouring Flora, goddess of flowers and fertility, the atmosphere was more playful. Public games, performances and colourful clothing. Conservative writers complained about the looseness of such celebrations. But for many women, they were rare moments of freedom from the usual constraints of modesty. If you were here during a Roman morning, you might see a matron sprinkling wine on the hearth as she whispers a prayer to Vesta, her palla neatly wrapped. Down the street, a freed woman buys a bronze amulet from a stall, bargaining over the price while the vendor swears it has kept 3 households safe from fever. At the forum, a priestess in white leads a small procession to a temple, the crowd falling silent as incense smoke rises into the air. For Roman women, religion was not separate from life. It was life. Every choice, every risk, every success was tied to divine favour or disfavour. The gods were both protectors and judges, and through ritual, women navigated a world where unseen forces were as real as the stones beneath their feet. In ancient Rome, marriage was less a romantic union and more a contract, an arrangement designed to merge families, secure political alliances, and ensure the continuation of a household's name. Love could exist in marriage, but it was not the primary expectation. For women, marriage defined much of their legal and social identity, and its rules were shaped by status, tradition, and sometimes the whims of politics. There were 2 main types of marriage for Roman citizens, cum manu and sine manu. In a cum manu marriage, a woman legally passed from the control, manus, of her father to that of her husband, becoming part of his family and subject to his authority. This was more common in the early Republic, but faded over time. The more prevalent form in later centuries was sine manu, where a woman remained under the authority of her birth family, usually her father, even after marriage. This gave her more independence in property matters and made divorce far easier. Marriages were often arranged when a girl was between 12 and 14 years old, though elite families sometimes betrothed daughters much earlier. The groom's family negotiated with the brides, discussing dowry amounts, political advantages, and social standing. The dowry does, money, land or valuables given by the bride's family, was intended to support the household, but could be reclaimed if the marriage ended. The wedding ceremony itself combined public display and private ritual. On the chosen day, the bride wore a saffron-coloured veil, flammeum, and a long white tunic tied with a special knot of Hercules, believed to be a symbol of fertility, and easily untied only by her husband. Her hair was parted into 6 sections and bound with woolen fillets. The couple joined right hands, dextrarum junctio, before witnesses, pledging their consent. Afterwards, a procession led the bride to her new home, carrying torches and singing ribald songs meant to ward off evil spirits. Once married, a woman's duties were clear: manage the household, bear children, and uphold her family's honour. In wealthy homes this meant supervising slaves, keeping accounts, and organising religious observances. In poorer households it meant doing much of the labour herself, cooking, cleaning, weaving, and raising children. Fidelity was expected of wives, but not strictly of husbands, a double standard that women were painfully aware of. Divorce in Rome was surprisingly easy compared to later periods. Either spouse could end the marriage simply by declaring the intent before witnesses. The dowry was usually returned, minus any deductions for misconduct. While divorce carried some stigma, it was far from rare, especially among the elite, where political alliances shifted quickly. Some women married and divorced multiple times, using marriage strategically to maintain influence or protect property. Love and passion existed, but they were often found outside formal marriage. Elite men were known for taking mistresses or engaging with courtesans, while women, though more constrained sometimes, had lovers. Adultery, however, could be dangerous for women. Under the Lex Julia de Adulteris Coascendis, introduced by Augustus, a husband was required to divorce an adulterous wife and could prosecute her, leading to exile and loss of property. Still, there were marriages founded on mutual respect and even affection. Letters, epitaphs and poems survive praising wives as companions, advisors and beloved partners. Inscriptions sometimes describe women as univira, having been married only once, as a mark of loyalty and virtue. Others hint at marriages filled with humour, shared struggles and genuine love, though these were exceptions in a system built on duty. If you were here in Rome on a wedding day, you'd see the streets buzzing with noise, a bride in her saffron veil walking to her husband's home, neighbours shouting jokes and blessings. A few streets over, in a quieter moment, a woman sits at a table with her brother, negotiating the return of her dowry after a short unhappy marriage. And in another house, a couple in their 50s shares bread and olives, laughing over a story they have told each other 100 times, their marriage as much partnership as obligation. In Rome, marriage could be a bond of power, a cage of duty, or, rarely, a union of hearts. For women, navigating it meant balancing loyalty, survival, and, when possible, personal happiness, all under the ever-watchful eyes of family and society. In ancient Rome, motherhood was not just a personal role, it was a civic duty. A woman's ability to bear and raise children was tied directly to the stability of the family and, in the eyes of the state, to the strength of the empire itself. For most Roman women, the measure of success was not wealth, beauty, or even social skill, but the number and quality of children they raised. Yet motherhood in Rome was also dangerous, exhausting, and shaped by brutal realities. Pregnancy began under the shadow of risk. Maternal mortality was high, and the absence of modern medicine meant that complications could easily turn fatal. Wealthier women could afford the services of trained midwives, obstetrices, and doctors, while poorer women relied on neighbours, relatives, and herbal remedies. Certain gods and goddesses were invoked at every stage: Juno Lucina for safe delivery, Diana for protection, and Carmenta for the health of both mother and child. Offerings were made, charms worn, and rituals performed in the hope of warding off misfortune. Childbirth itself was a communal event, but men were excluded. Women laboured surrounded by other women. Midwives, family members, and sometimes experienced slaves. Pain relief was minimal, though herbal infusions, wine, or even poppy-based preparations might be used. In difficult births, midwives employed a mix of practical skill and superstition, using certain chants, touching the mother with objects sacred to the gods, or burning specific herbs to open the womb. When a child was born, survival was never guaranteed. Infant mortality was extremely high, with many children dying in their first year. On the 9th day for boys and the 8th day for girls, the family held the dies lustricus, a naming ceremony. The baby received a bulla, a protective amulet to ward off evil, and was officially welcomed into the family. Until then, the father had the right of ius vitae nescisc, the power to accept or reject the child, though outright rejection was rarer than popular myth suggests, especially among poorer families who valued every potential worker. Motherhood in practice depended heavily on class. Elite women might nurse their own infants or employ a wet nurse, nutrix, often a trusted slave or freed woman. A good wet nurse was valued not only for her milk, but also for her influence. Romans believed that a child absorbed character traits from the woman who fed them. Poorer women usually breastfed their own children, often while continuing to work in fields, markets, or workshops. As children grew, their upbringing became the mother's primary responsibility, at least in early years. She taught basic manners, religious duties, and practical skills. Boys would eventually move into the world of formal education, while girls often remained under their mother's guidance, learning domestic management, weaving, and the social skills they would need as wives. Wealthier mothers supervised tutors and oversaw lessons, while poorer mothers worked alongside their children, teaching through daily labour. Discipline was strict by modern standards. Roman parents believed in shaping obedience early, using both verbal correction and physical punishment. At the same time, inscriptions and personal letters revealed deep affection between mothers and children, with women mourning the loss of a child for years and honouring them with carefully chosen epitaphs. Public policy even encouraged motherhood. Under Augustus, the Lex Julia and Lex Poppaea rewarded women who had 3 or more children with legal privileges, including exemption from male guardianship. These laws reflected the belief that a woman's highest contribution to Rome was producing citizens. Childless women, especially among the elite, could face social suspicion, as if failing to fulfill their purpose. If you were here in Rome on a spring morning, you might see a matron in a shaded garden, watching her children play while she spins wool, a wet nurse seated nearby with a swaddled infant. Down in the Subura, a market seller balances her toddler on her hip while weighing olives for a customer. In another home, a mother guides her daughter's hands on a loom, explaining that one day she will do the same for her own children. Motherhood in Rome was a role that demanded endurance, devotion, and resilience. It was celebrated in poetry, honoured in law, and immortalised in stone, but it was also marked by loss, hardship, and the constant awareness that a woman's worth in society was often measured by the children she bore and raised. In ancient Rome, slavery was the foundation of the economy, and women made up a significant portion of the enslaved population. For enslaved women, life was defined by the needs, whims, and power of their owners. Freedom was rare, abuse was common, and survival depended on a delicate balance of obedience, skill, and luck. Unlike freeborn women who had at least some legal protections, enslaved women were considered property, bought, sold, and inherited, like livestock or furniture. Women entered slavery in many ways through capture in war, piracy, punishment for debts, or simply being born to an enslaved mother. The slave markets of Rome and its provinces were filled with women and girls from across the empire: Gauls, Greeks, Syrians, Egyptians, Thracians, each carrying the marks of their origin in their speech, clothing, or physical features. Traders often exaggerated or invented stories about them to drive up prices, describing a girl as skilled at weaving, trained in music, or gentle and obedient, regardless of truth. The work assigned to enslaved women varied greatly depending on the household. In elite villas, they served as ancilli, personal attendants, dressing their mistresses, arranging hair, fetching perfumes, or managing jewellery. Others worked in kitchens, laundries, or storerooms, keeping the complex machinery of a wealthy home running smoothly. Some were highly trained specialists, scribes, midwives, or craftswomen whose skills increased their value. In poorer households, enslaved women performed the same labour as free women, but with none of the freedom. They cooked, cleaned, hauled water, and cared for children, often alongside their owners. On farms, female slaves worked in the fields, planting, harvesting, and tending animals, enduring long hours in harsh conditions. Many enslaved women faced the additional burden of sexual exploitation. Owners could use them as concubines or force them into prostitution, especially in urban brothels. The law offered no recourse. Their bodies were legally the property of their masters. Children born to enslaved mothers were also slaves, increasing the owner's wealth and ensuring the cycle continued. Some enslaved women were allowed to live semi-independently, especially if they worked in trades like selling goods in the market or running small stalls. They were expected to turn over a portion, or all, of their earnings to their owner. This arrangement sometimes allowed a woman to save money toward manumission, the legal process of buying her freedom, though many never accumulated enough to succeed. Manumission, when it came, could transform a life. Freed women, liberté, gained legal rights, could own property, and even run businesses. However, they often remained tied to their former masters through obligations of loyalty and service. Some freed women prospered, passing wealth and skills to their children, who would be born free Roman citizens. Others struggled to survive without the resources of a household to support them. Punishment for disobedience or failure ranged from beatings to branding, chaining, or being sold to harsher conditions. Runaways faced severe consequences, including execution. Yet resistance took many forms, working slowly, breaking tools, spreading gossip, or maintaining forbidden relationships. Some formed strong bonds with other slaves, creating small communities within the household or neighbourhood. If you were here in Rome on a market day, you might see an enslaved woman balancing a basket of figs on her head, selling them with a smile, while her owner watches from a shaded stall. In a wealthy atrium, an ornatrix bends over her mistress's hair, her fingers moving expertly while she listens to whispered secrets she can never repeat. In a cramped farmstead outside the city, a woman bends to cut wheat, her hands blistered, but her mind counting the days until harvest is over. For enslaved women, life was a constant negotiation between survival and dignity. Some carved out spaces of autonomy, some endured quietly, and a few found paths to freedom. But all lived under a system that reduced them to property, their futures determined by the desires of others. In a society that relied on their labour, yet rarely acknowledged their humanity. In ancient Rome, a woman's social value was often tied to her youth, fertility, and ability to manage a household. Once she reached the end of her reproductive years, society's view of her shifted. For some, age brought respect, authority, and freedom from certain obligations. For others, it meant invisibility, financial vulnerability, and dependence on family members. Old age in Rome could be a time of comfort or of hardship, depending on a woman's status, health, and connections. Among the elite, an older woman, especially one who had successfully raised children, might wield considerable influence within her family. As the mater familias, she was the central figure in domestic decision-making, guiding younger women in matters of household management, marriage negotiations, and religious observances. Without the burden of pregnancy and child-rearing, she could devote more energy to maintaining alliances, managing estates, or even acting as an informal political advisor to sons and grandsons. Inscriptions and letters describe older women as wise counsellors whose opinions carried weight in family councils. Financial independence made all the difference. A widow with property of her own could live comfortably, employ servants, and enjoy social activities without the oversight of a male guardian. Roman law allowed women who had borne a certain number of children to be freed from tutelar male guardianship, giving them full control over their finances. This autonomy could make older women key patrons in their communities, supporting temples, sponsoring public works, or helping poorer relatives. For women of modest means, old age was less about influence and more about survival. Without personal wealth, they depended on adult children, extended family, or patrons. Widows without support might turn to small trades, selling goods in the market, spinning wool, or working as midwives. In rural areas, older women often continue to labour in the fields or tend animals well into their later years, as every pair of hands was needed. Health in old age was precarious. Without modern medicine, ailments like arthritis, failing eyesight, and tooth loss were common and largely untrattable. Wealthier women could at least access soothing baths, herbal remedies, and skilled physicians. Poorer women relied on home cures, religious healing rituals, and the support of neighbours. Socially, older women occupied a complex position. On one hand, they were seen as keepers of tradition, passing down religious practices, family histories, and domestic skills. On the other, Roman literature, often written by men, sometimes mocked or vilified elderly women as gossiping busybodies, witches, or seductresses past their prime. Satirists like Juvenal and Martial painted unflattering caricatures that reflected broader anxieties about ageing and female independence. In certain religious roles, however, age was an asset. Older priestesses and attendants were valued for their experience and perceived purity from sexual temptation. Women too old for marriage could dedicate themselves to temple service or act as guardians of sacred rites. These positions provided both respect and a sense of purpose beyond family life. In poorer neighbourhoods, elderly women often became informal community figures, watching children while parents worked, offering advice, or helping organise small religious festivals. These roles, though unpaid, could earn them gratitude and a modest form of protection from neighbours. If you were here in Rome, you might see an elderly matron in a shaded portico, dictating a letter to her steward while sipping watered wine. In the crowded Subura district, a grey-haired woman sells baskets she's woven, pausing to scold a group of boys playing too close to her stall. In a rural village, a stooped grandmother stirs a pot of lentils over an open fire, telling her grandchildren stories of their ancestors as the smoke curls into the evening sky. For Roman women, old age was not a uniform experience. It could bring dignity and autonomy, or poverty and neglect. Yet even when stripped of beauty, fertility, or physical strength, many found ways to remain vital through family influence, economic skill, religious service, or simply by surviving in a world that often valued them most in their youth. In ancient Rome, death was never a purely private matter. It was a public, ritualised event that revealed the values of the living as much as it honoured the dead. For women, the way they were mourned and remembered depended on their social status, family ties, and how well they had fulfilled their roles in life. Death could be a moment of solemn dignity, ostentatious display, or quiet neglect. When a Roman woman died, the process began at home. Her eyes were closed, her body washed, anointed with oils, and dressed in her finest clothing, sometimes the very garments she wore at her wedding. A coin, often a small bronze or silver piece, was placed in her mouth or hand as payment to Ciaran, the mythical ferryman who carried souls across the river Styx. This was both a religious gesture and a safeguard, ensuring she could pass into the afterlife without being stranded at its threshold. In wealthier families, professional mourners, préfiqués, were hired to wail, chant praises, and publicly grieve. These women, trained in the art of lamentation, would recount the deceased's virtues, accomplishments, and family connections, often in a way that elevated the family's prestige. The mourning was not quiet, it was theatrical, intended for the ears of neighbours, clients, and rivals alike. The funeral procession, pompa funebri, was a key moment. The body was carried on a bier through the streets, accompanied by relatives, friends, and sometimes musicians. If the woman had been of high status, her procession might include symbolic displays, ancestral masks, imagines, emblems of family offices, or even actors dressed as famous ancestors. For poorer women, the procession was smaller, perhaps only a few neighbours helping to carry her to the cemetery. Burial practices varied by period and wealth. In early Rome, cremation was common. Later, inhumation, burial of the body, became more widespread. Wealthy families might build elaborate tombs along the roads leading out of the city, ensuring that passers-by would see the name and virtues of the deceased carved in stone. These inscriptions often celebrated a woman's role as a faithful wife, univira, devoted mother, and diligent keeper of the household. Some included touching personal details, like her skill at weaving or her kindness to slaves. Poorer women were often buried in communal graves or modest plots maintained by burial clubs, collegia funerititia, which pooled resources to ensure members received a proper funeral. Even among the working class, there was pride in providing a decent send-off, as neglecting burial rites was considered both shameful and dangerous. The soul might wander, restless and vengeful. Mourning customs were strictly observed. Family members wore dark, unadorned clothing and refrained from public festivities for a set period, typically 30 days for women. Close female relatives might loosen their hair, go without jewellery, and avoid cosmetics, outwardly displaying grief. In some traditions, they touched the corpse or walked barefoot in the procession, acts that symbolised humility before the loss. Religious beliefs about the afterlife shaped these rituals. Romans imagined the dead joining the shades, manes in the underworld, living on in a shadowy but peaceful existence if properly honoured. Annual festivals like the Parentalia and Lemuria brought families to the tombs with offerings of food, wine and garlands, ensuring the spirits remained benevolent. Neglected spirits were feared as malevolent ghosts, capable of bringing illness or misfortune to the living. For women who died young, especially in childbirth, epitaphs often expressed deep sorrow and frustration at a life cut short. For those who lived into old age, the inscriptions might list children and grandchildren, marking them as the matriarch of a thriving family. Freed women sometimes used their tombs to proclaim their journey from slavery to independence, leaving a permanent record of resilience. If you were here, you might see a solemn procession winding through the forum, mourners chanting, as a bier draped in embroidered cloth passes by. In a quieter quarter, neighbours gather at dawn to carry a modest coffin to the city's edge, a widow clutching a single lamp for her sister's grave. Beyond the walls, among rows of carved stone, a family lays fresh garlands on a tomb and whispers a prayer that their mother's shade will watch over them kindly. In Rome, death was not the end of a woman's influence. Through monuments, memory, and ritual, She remained present, her virtues praised, her name spoken during feasts, her story woven into the family's identity. To die without rights was a tragedy. To be remembered well was the closest the Romans came to immortality. In ancient Rome, survival for women, whether patrician or plebeian, often depended not solely on family ties but on a network of female relationships. In a society where political power officially belonged to men, women carved out influence through informal alliances, mutual aid, and carefully maintained bonds of trust. These networks could be sources of comfort, economic stability, and even quiet resistance against the limitations imposed by law and custom. For elite women, friendship was often interwoven with politics. Marriages linked powerful families, but so did the alliances between wives, sisters, and mothers of influential men. A senator's wife might introduce another matron to her husband's patron, arrange a marriage for a niece, or pass along information heard in the atrium during social calls. Wealthy women hosted gatherings where they discussed business matters disguised as casual conversation, all while pretending the topics were merely fashion or temple donations. Letters between such women reveal careful diplomacy, coded language, and an understanding that a well-placed word could change a family's fortunes. For freed women and the working class, networks functioned more like extended families. Market sellers formed cooperative relationships, watching each other's stalls when one was sick or sharing suppliers to get better prices. Midwives relied on reputations spread by word of mouth. A trusted obstetrix might serve 3 generations of women in the same neighbourhood. In taverns, laundries and public baths, women exchanged practical advice. Where to buy cheaper grain, which magistrate's clerk could be bribed, whose landlord was lenient. Friendships were also deeply personal. Inscriptions on tombs sometimes commemorate women as amicissima, dearest friend, a relationship honoured alongside family ties. Poetry and private letters from women like Sulpicia suggest that female companionship could provide emotional intimacy and solidarity in a world where men controlled most public spaces. These relationships often crossed class lines. A wealthy woman might maintain lifelong loyalty to a former slave who became her confidant, or a freed woman might sponsor the daughter of a patroness in marriage. Religious life reinforced these bonds. Many festivals, especially those dedicated to goddesses like Bona Dea, Juno and Ceres, were women-only events, free from the scrutiny of men. Here, women prayed together, shared food, and discussed matters they could not speak of openly elsewhere. Temple service also offered opportunities for mentoring, as older priestesses taught younger ones ritual skills and moral conduct. Support networks were vital in times of crisis. A woman abandoned by her husband might turn to her friends for shelter or introductions to potential protectors. A widow could rely on her female circle to help manage property or navigate the legal system. Even within slavery, women formed bonds, sharing small comforts, protecting each other from abuse when possible, and passing along strategies for survival. Sometimes, these relationships offered more than just help. They provided cover for acts of quiet defiance. Friends might hide a forbidden love affair, lend money in secret to avoid a husband's control, or pool resources to buy a member's freedom from slavery. Such acts carried risk, but loyalty between women could outweigh fear of reprisal. If you were here in Rome on an ordinary afternoon, you might find a group of matrons gathered in a shaded courtyard, ostensibly weaving, but really trading news about a magistrate's upcoming vote. In the bustling Subura, Two market women lean against a wall, laughing as they swap tips on how to outwit a demanding customer. At the public baths, steam curls through the air as a circle of women discuss a neighbour's difficult childbirth, offering remedies and prayers. These networks of female friendship and solidarity were rarely recorded by male historians, but they were the invisible framework of Roman society. They kept households running, passed along knowledge, and gave women leverage in a world that officially denied them power. In whispers, glances, and shared labour, Roman women built their own quiet empire, one sustained not by marble monuments or senatorial decrees, but by trust. The legacy of Roman women is not found solely in marble statues or grand inscriptions. It lives in fragments, whispers, and the everyday traces they left behind. Ancient historians, almost always men, often judged women by their proximity to famous men, as mothers, wives, or scandalous lovers. Yet when you look past the official narratives, a different picture emerges, a tapestry woven from personal letters, epitaphs, graffiti, and the archaeological remains of daily life. For elite women, memory was often carefully curated by family. Tomb inscriptions for matrons highlighted virtues like pudicitaia, chastity, pietas, duty to family and gods, and industria, diligence. A well-born woman might be remembered as a univira, faithful to one husband, or as the mother of sons who became senators. Sometimes these inscriptions were formulaic, more about projecting an ideal than reflecting the truth. Yet between the lines, we see glimpses of personality, mentions of generosity, humour, or skill in music and poetry. Freed women and working-class women often used their tombs to tell their own stories more directly. Some proudly recorded their trades: lenifica, wool worker, ornatrix, hairdresser, nutrix, wet nurse, asserting identities that were rarely celebrated in literature. Others noted the journey from slavery to freedom, marking their final resting place as a testament to survival. In these modest memorials you can sense a desire not just to be remembered, but to be remembered on their own terms. Memory could also be preserved through family altars and ancestor worship. Portrait busts displayed in the home might include women alongside men, signalling their role in the family lineage. During festivals like the Parentalia, descendants brought offerings to tombs, speaking the names of their ancestors aloud. In this way, a woman's presence could echo through generations, her image and virtues kept alive in the minds of those who came after. Yet not all legacies were honourable. Satirists like Juvenal immortalised certain women as symbols of vice or excess, greedy wives, scheming stepmothers, or adulterous lovers. These portraits, exaggerated for humour or moral lesson, have coloured perceptions of Roman women for centuries, often overshadowing more balanced accounts. Material remains tell quieter stories. A set of bone hairpins in a grave hints at a woman's sense of style. A collection of small clay lamps, worn smooth from use, suggests evenings spent in close company. Graffiti on a wall in Pompeii might record a romantic boast, a joke between friends, or a political slogan scrawled by a woman with strong opinions. These artefacts speak to lives lived fully, even if history's official record did not care to notice. In some cases, women shaped the historical record through patronage. Wealthy widows endowed temples, sponsored games, or funded public buildings, ensuring their names would be inscribed for all to see. Cornelia, mother of the Gracchi, was remembered as an ideal of Roman motherhood. Livia Drusilla, wife of Augustus, wielded influence so subtly that she shaped imperial politics for decades. Whether revered or reviled, such women became touchstones in debates about female power. If you were here walking through a Roman necropolis at dusk, you'd pass grand marble tombs and humble stone markers, each holding a story. You might stop at one with an inscription: to Claudia, who loved her husband, cared for her children, and spoke kindly to everyone. Nearby another reads, to Prima, freedwoman of Gaius, who wove with skill and sold her work in the Forum for 20 years. In the fading light, their names remain legible, defying the centuries. The legacy of Roman women is a patchwork of the public and the private, the celebrated and the forgotten. They shaped their world not only in the shadow of emperors, but in kitchens, workshops, markets, and temples. And though many of their stories were left out of the grand histories, they survive, in stone, in memory, and in the countless invisible ways they kept Rome alive.